Brian Hall was going over the restaurant's monthly statement for the umpteenth time and closed his eyes warily. Trying to figure out why the restaurant was in the red, the man went through hundreds of possible reasons in his head, but he couldn't figure it out. The problem was definitely inside the restaurant, and thus it was impossible to understand what it was simply by going through the paperwork. Brian wrinkled his forehead, trying to come up with a solution. Suddenly, an interesting thought popped into his mind. As the expression on the businessman's face changed, it was obvious that he really liked this idea. Why didn't I think of it before? Brian thought with a smile. Since the man had been the co-owner of the restaurant for less than a year, the management didn't know what he looked like. Therefore, if Brian were to come to the restaurant manager and ask for a job, he'd be able to see the situation at the restaurant from the inside. The longer the businessman thought about it, the more convinced he got that his idea would work. Deciding not to put things off, Brian started implementing this idea the very next day. First of all, Brian used makeup to alter his appearance. Then he picked out his outfit, which was supposed to turn him into an unremarkable man who came to get a job. "Well, that's much better," Brian said, looking at his reflection in the mirror. Wishing himself luck, the man went into the interview with the restaurant manager. To make sure everything was as believable as possible, Brian called in advance to arrange the interview. But when the unsuspecting manager saw the intern in person, his surprise knew no bounds. "Frankly, I thought you'd be much younger. Personally, I don't mind if you trained at our restaurant, don't get me wrong. But our team is young, so it might be hard for you to find some common ground with the rest of the staff," said Howard Lopez. The manager's words made Brian blush to the roots of his hair and look away. The man was embarrassed by the fact that, being a 35-year-old successful businessman, he had to pretend to ask for a trainee position. Having finally pulled himself together, Brian said, "Don't worry, sir. I'm sure I can handle it." The manager shook his head but didn't object and gave Brian the trainee position. Of course, Howard Lopez couldn't have even suspected that it was one of the co-owners of the restaurant who actually owned the majority of the shares that was standing in front of him. In the meantime, Brian got to work. Basically, his duties were simple and boiled down to helping in the kitchen and monitoring the occupancy. Observing the chef and the kitchen staff, Brian noticed that there were too many dishes sent back by the customers for one reason or another. At some point, Brian decided to ask the manager about it, but he only smiled and said, "What does it matter if the customers eat them or not? They still pay for the food, so the restaurant didn't incur any losses and everyone's happy." But Brian didn't like that attitude in the very least. The men respected the work of the chef and the kitchen staff, who put their soul into cooking each dish. However, what interested Brian the most was what they later did with the food that the customers sent back. But when he tried to ask the chef about it, he ran into the wall of hostility and alienation. "Why are you asking? Why are you sniffing around? Brian, you're just a trainee, aren't you? So mind your own business," added the stern man in a white coat and a cap. Brian ignored the chef's offensive outburst, knowing full well it was too early to reveal who he really was. But there was another reason why he decided against giving himself out just yet. The more time Brian spent at the restaurant, the more he felt uncomfortable with the way things worked there. For the most part, the staff only cared about themselves and not the customers. The chef dreamed of finishing his shift as soon as possible and going home. Meanwhile, the waiters and the hostess only cared about getting generous tips, the amount of which was actually quite impressive most of the time. Sensing that Brian wasn't like them, the rest of the staff started treating him with contempt, bordering on outright malice and ridicule. They enjoyed humiliating the inexperienced trainee who couldn't stand up for himself. They often made fun of the man and were actually rather harsh in their comments, pointing out his age and lack of experience. At some point, Brian even wanted to reveal his secret, but fortunately, he managed to pull himself together and continue his covert observation. Meanwhile, the attacks of his colleagues were getting more and more sophisticated and unpleasant by the minute. The chef, who disliked Brian from day one, was especially mean. Unfortunately, not all restaurant employees shared the opinion of Edward Jackson. Brian was actually very surprised when one of the new waitresses took his side. Melanie Watts got the job at the restaurant a month before Brian and was actually nice to him. Moreover, the woman tried to help the unfortunate trainee who got into a real snake pit. Meanwhile, the rest of the staff clearly disapproved of Melanie's behavior, treating her as if she was doing something very wrong, something that went against the unspoken restaurant policy. Brian didn't even realize when he became friends with Melanie, who had recently turned 26. The man liked the fact that the young waitress didn't chase the tips and did everything she could to make the customers feel comfortable at the restaurant. Moreover, Melanie was never late and often stayed in the restaurant until late. Brian knew that the young woman was working overtime, cleaning the kitchen in order to get the bonus at the end of the month. But there was another reason which the woman kept secret. Brian felt in his heart that there was something Melanie wasn't telling him. To figure out what was happening, the businessman in disguise decided to stay late at the restaurant and follow the waitress. Hiding in the back room, he started waiting for everyone to leave. At first, nothing seemed suspicious. But then, Melanie took out an old bag from her purse and started putting the leftover food in it. Brian knew that those were the orders that customers had sent back for some reason. Oh God, what's going on here? Is Melanie stealing? Flashed through the businessman's head. Determined to find out the truth once and for all, Brian came out of his hiding place and approached the waitress. Having seen him, Melanie started shaking with fear and dropped the tray. The loud clanging iron and the sound of the dishes breaking brought the unfortunate waitress back to her senses. What are you doing here?" Melanie asked, stammering at every word. Not knowing what to say, Brian blushed and looked away. Then he pulled himself together and pointed to the package with the food in it. No, it's not what it looks like. I'm not stealing. This food was already paid for by the customers. I'm simply taking it home to my kids. I have twins, a boy and a girl. They're 5 years old." Melanie exclaimed, trying to justify herself. "Kids? You never said anything about having kids. But why should they eat leftovers from the restaurant? And where is their father?" Brian asked in surprise. Instead of a response, Melanie covered her face with her hands and burst into tears. Feeling guilty, Brian put his arm around the waitress's shoulder and tried to comfort her. When Melanie finally calmed down, she told him her sad story. As it turned out, Melanie Watt's husband had died 3 years ago in a terrible car accident. Unfortunately, the woman grew up at an orphanage and never knew her parents. Since there was no one to help the single mother, she got a job as a waitress. Seeing how much food got sent back to the kitchen, Melanie decided to take it home to her kids, who were very happy about it. Having told Brian her story, the tearful waitress didn't even suspect that he wasn't who he claimed to be. Having heard Melanie's confession, the trainee hugged her and promised to help solve her financial problems. Yeah, and how are you planning on doing it?" the waitress asked in disbelief. But Brian already knew that things were about to change at the restaurant. After seeing Melanie home, the businessman started analyzing the situation. All this time, Brian was making notes in his notebook in order to see the real expenses and income of the restaurant. Half an hour later, the businessman realized that the restaurant manager was buying cheap and low-quality products, all the while putting them down as expensive ingredients in the books. Then the manager kept the resulting difference, thereby causing significant losses to the restaurants. Only now did Brian understand why the customers sent back so many orders. The fact was that the quality of products was truly horrible, which is why no one wanted to eat the food. The chef was most likely in on it, getting a hefty compensation from the restaurant manager for his silence. The next day, Brian washed off all of his makeup and changed from his casual clothes into a business suit. Then he got into his expensive car and drove to the restaurant. Needless to say, the restaurant staff was very surprised to see the trainee who turned into a successful businessman overnight for reasons they didn't know. Ignoring the astonished hostess, Brian stepped inside and made his way to the manager's office. Seeing the co-owner of the restaurant in front of him, Howard Lopez was caught off guard. "What does all this dressing up mean? And why did you apply for the trainee job?" the manager exclaimed, clasping his hands. Brian paused for effect and answered loudly. "It means that you're fired, Mr. Lopez, and don't forget to take the chef with you. For now on, you're banned from this restaurant." Howard Lopez nodded understandingly and hurried out of the office. In the depths of his soul, the manager was glad that he didn't have to face much harsher consequences for his actions. Meanwhile, he didn't really care about what would happen to the chef. In the meantime, Brian held a staff meeting where he explained from that point on, they all needed to adjust their approach to work. As for Melanie Watts, the businessman didn't forget about her and made her the new manager. Brian Hall was well aware of the hard work and perseverance of the waitress, whom others considered somewhat strange. Now that Melanie's life had changed beyond recognition, she could finally think about herself. Spending all of her free time with Brian, the woman realized that she liked him a lot, and she didn't want to fight her feelings. And there was no doubt in her heart that Brian felt the same way about her. 6 months later, Brian and Melanie held a small wedding that tied their lives together forever. There was a rumor that the couple rushed to tie the knot because the bride was pregnant. No one really knew whether it was true or not, but judging by Melanie's glow, those rumors might well have been true.